What is kleptomania? How can we understand pathological stealing? During the late 19th century, wealthy women of the highest classes started stealing from the newly opened department stores. This behavior baffled the medical professionals of the time. These women could just have bought what they stole. How could their behavior be explained? It had to be insanity. They suffered from a mental disorder, namely kleptomania. But what is kleptomania? Perhaps it can best be described as the irresistible impulse to steal, usually for reasons other than personal use or financial gain. We first hear about this mental disorder in 1816, when Swiss physician Jacques-André Mathis describes its symptoms. In 1840, C.C. Mark and Esquirol used the term kleptomania for the first time. This is decades before the rise of department stores. Kleptomania was thus not invented specifically as an excuse for department store theft. Not everyone, however, was convinced that these wealthy thieves were suffering from kleptomania. Was kleptomania a legitimate mental disorder? And even if it was, what did it mean to be perceived as suffering from kleptomania? In some cases, it offered a way out of a prison sentence. But at what cost? Until now, many historians have emphasized the link between women, kleptomania, and department store theft. This cartoon is in line with this perspective. However, many newspaper articles and cartoons offer a different perspective. With new digital techniques and a criminological perspective, a fresh light can be shed on historical media sources. Many historical media sources depict men as suffering from kleptomania. Women were still in the majority when it concerned media articles, but men appeared far more than expected. Cartoons, on the other hand, nearly always showed men to be suffering from kleptomania. This is not in line with the medical literature of the time, which only extremely rarely linked kleptomania to men. The question then is, why were men relatively often linked to kleptomania in the media? Perhaps we can explain this by arguing that newspapers like to report on the extraordinary, and not on the mundane. A male sufferer of kleptomania was perhaps more newsworthy than a female one. Secondly, the existing studies regarding kleptomania solely focus on theft from department stores. Yet, many cases of kleptomania that were described in historical newspaper articles did not occur in department stores. Sometimes cases concerning pickpocketing, crop theft, and even burglary were attributed to kleptomania. We can distinguish three types of people who were described as suffering from kleptomania. The first type constitutes the rich offender who wanted to escape a prison sentence. A famous example is Miss Castle, the wife of a millionaire, who had stolen furs from a department store. She was sentenced to 3 months imprisonment. She never served her sentence and she was released by the English Home Secretary. Her kleptomania defense played an important role in this release. The second type concerns the true pathological type. These are individuals whose stealing can understandably be characterized as pathological. Take for example Miss Bida from Paris, who stole smoking pipes from shops. When her house was searched, the police found 2,600 smoking pipes. Central to kleptomania is a debate about its legitimacy as a mental disorder. There are scholars who dispute it. The example of Miss Bida, however, shows that some stealing behavior can understandably be understood as pathological. What we can argue is that in the late 19th and early 20th century, some cases of theft were mislabeled as kleptomania. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, kleptomania is an extremely rare mental disorder. It occurs in less than 0.1% of the population. It is thus extremely unlikely that one would encounter more than one person suffering from kleptomania in a day as a shopkeeper. Yet, some historical sources speak of an epidemic of kleptomania. This therefore seems to be unlikely. That is why we can argue that certainly, when the phenomenon first came into existence, some thieving behavior was misinterpreted as a mental disorder. This brings us to the third and last type, the thrill seeker. We should understand that many people do not steal for material gain, but rather for the thrilling feeling of stealing. Thrill-seeking provides a logical explanation of why contemporaries imagined the theft committed as senseless. The product was not the reward, but the feeling of euphoria was. Hints of thrill-seeking also constantly occur in historical newspapers. Words such as seduction, temptation, and attraction continually appear when newspapers report about kleptomania, but one of the best examples of the thrill seeker was found in film. A German film, Was Frauen träumen, contained one such character. The character's name is Rina. She's pictured on the left. Interestingly, the word kleptomania is not even used once in the film. Instead, a scene shows the following conversation. Rina is handled roughly by Walter, to whom she says,
Ist eigentlich so grob zu mir?
Weil es eine Affenschande ist, was Sie treiben.
Was denn?
Finden Sie es in Ordnung, so einfach zu klauen?
In Ordnung? Nein, ich habe mir eigentlich noch nie darüber den Kopf zerbrochen. Ich finde es so aufregend. Ich brauche es. So wie Sie Zigaretten rauchen müssen.
Und außerdem bringt es was ein, nicht wahr?
Na, wie naiv Sie sind. Was glauben Sie, dass so ein Aschenbecher kostet? Einen halben Franken höchstens, aber er glitzert.
There are several actors who played an important role in shaping the way people thought about kleptomania. Their attitudes towards kleptomania were important in shaping and reshaping both the rules and the frame in which people suffering from kleptomania were seen. For the kleptomania diagnosis, there were three kinds of actors that were of importance. These were psychiatrists, journalists, and the judiciary. For mental disorders such as kleptomania, the psychiatrist is arguably the most important actor. A psychiatry defines and the psychiatrist decides who should be considered insane. Psychiatrists made the decision if someone's thieving behavior needed to be seen as pathology or simply as a criminal act. This power can also be observed in films. For example, in Die vom Rümelplatz, a doctor's note caused the release of Mother Flock after she was arrested for theft.
Was hat denn Madame Flock wieder gestohlen?
Eine Uhr.
So? Eine Uhr?
Ja.
Nicht eine richtig gehende Uhr?
Tja, ob sie richtig ging, das weiß ich nicht. Jedenfalls war es eine Uhr.
Sie hat getickt.
Natürlich hat sie getickt.
Nee, ich meine nicht die Uhr, sondern die Frau Flock, ob sie einen Tick gehabt hat.
Ja, das war's, Baby.
Na, dann warten Sie mal einen Augenblick.
Ja.
So. Hier ist die behördlich bescheinigte Klauerlaubnis von Frau Direktor Flock. Also tun Sie mir einen Gefallen, ja. Sagen Sie ihr doch, sie möchte gleich rüberkommen. Die Vorstellung beginnt jeden Augenblick. Ich bin hier in Todesangst. Nicht
Also
sagen Sie
gut,
das mal.
jawohl.
Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Generaldirektor.
Psychiatrists decided if you would be represented as an ill person or as a thief. The judiciary made this claim official if someone was convicted in court. Journalists were able to claim that someone was one or the other. They too were influential in shaping the image of kleptomania and how it was understood by its readership. The debate in newspapers that was most important when it concerns rulemaking covered the question if kleptomania was a legitimate diagnosis, or if these people were just ordinary thieves. Generally, Dutch journalists did not argue that judges or psychiatrists were wrong to label someone as suffering from kleptomania. An important exception to this were the socialist newspapers. They emphasized the unequal treatment of the poor compared to the rich, and saw kleptomania as class injustice. Kleptomania was, and still can be, used in criminal proceedings to either wholly or partially declare the accused as criminally insane. The insanity defense that is still used as of today can be found in the Dutch Penal Code of 1886. He who commits an act that cannot be imputed to him because of his defective developments or mental disorder of his mental faculties is not punishable. This insanity defense is of course very much open to the interpretation of the psychiatrist. His reputation would be damaged if his interpretation of the law was flawed. This is exactly what happened between 1907 and 1910, when the discipline of forensic psychiatry came under a lot of pressure because of the Papendrecht court case. Someone had broken the window of the town hall in Papendrecht. The suspect of the crime, Hendrik Garsthagen, claimed to have been innocent, but had nevertheless gone to the town hall to turn himself in. In the basement of the town hall, law enforcement authorities beat Garsthagen until he bled. Jacob Quakernaat, who had actually broken the window, was brought to the town hall and was also made to pay. All this prompted Garsthagen to publish his story in the newspaper. In response, the law enforcement authorities sued him for slander. Because of the scandalous nature of the case, the story was picked up by national newspapers. Journalists and cartoon artists from liberal and socialist newspapers chose the side of the abused man. During the last court case, a psychiatric report was published. Psychiatrists had examined Garsthagen and all his witnesses. Their verdict was that most of them were insane or unreliable. This led to an outrage in the press, which viewed Garsthagen as a victim, not as insane. The media had the power to go against the judgment of psychiatrists. It influenced how their audience viewed the insanity law, a law that was essential for kleptomania. More than 10 years after the scandal, there were still reports about it in the newspapers. These reports, however, show that the Papendrecht case was a one-off scandal. The psychiatrists had gone beyond the pale, and though it had left a scar, the damage was not permanent. Psychiatric conditions, such as kleptomania, remained an important ground for exclusion in court cases. The Papendrecht case influenced both the law itself and the public opinion of the law. The case exposed the power relations between influential actors and the struggle for who should be perceived as insane, which was extremely important for mental disorders, such as kleptomania. The socialist media might have been critical of the diagnosis, but it is important to note that a majority of contemporaries did believe kleptomania to be a legitimate mental disorder. Once someone was labeled as either a sufferer of kleptomania or a thief, a stigma followed. Irving Goffman understood stigma as the situation of the individual who is disqualified from full social acceptance. Stigma can be understood as existing out of 5 different components. These are labeling, stereotyping, othering, discrimination and status loss, and lastly, power. Scholars started to observe kleptomania in a wide variety of different environments after department store theft had popularized the diagnosis. There were several theories about kleptomania. During the late 19th century, the criminal anthropology of Lombroso was dominant. One of his key ideas was that of atavism, the recurrence of criminal traits of an ancestor in a subsequent generation. A major newspaper in 1910, for example, wrote about the link between kleptomania and atavism. Some London physicians are inclined to see kleptomania as a kind of atavism, a relapse into the habits and instincts of rough primitive men. At a time when the female dragged and robbed everything to make the nest or den more comfortable for her offspring. The instinct that urges women to steal in the 20th century differs little from the primordial female that used to gather large stocks of food, even when it was completely redundant. In the same time period, there was also the concept of degeneration, championed by Morel and later by Magnon, which became increasingly popular. Degeneration, the belief that mental illnesses were hereditary and would become increasingly worse over time through generations, would remain popular even after psychiatry had disregarded the concept. Around the First World War, the Freudian school of thought became more dominant. Instead of explaining kleptomania as an atavistic trait, the disciples of Freud explained kleptomania by pointing towards unfulfilled sexuality, penis envy, and fear of castration. A follower of the Freudian school of thought, Wilhelm Steckel, wrote about a woman who stole pencils. His reading was that the pencils symbolized penises. According to Steckel, it was her subconscious sexual instinct that drove her to commit theft. It were these criminological and medical scholars who made sure that kleptomania remained relevant within society. In cartoons, films, and newspapers, we can find stereotypes of people that were perceived to suffer from kleptomania. Stereotypes, however, were different for different groups of people. These concerned class, ethnicity, and gender. Upper-class women and men were much more likely to be described as victims who were to be pitied, unlike their poor counterparts, who were thought to be unintelligent and dangerous for society. In films, actors that depicted characters suffering from kleptomania twitched with their eyes, made weird movements with their arms, or made peculiar noises.
Wait a minute.
Wait, just a moment. I feel that I must take you into my confidence.
Yeah?
You see, Sergeant, Mr. Kinney is a very rich man and a very efficient businessman. But like many millionaires, he has, well, certain idiosyncrasies. Yeah.
Well, you don't look good at that.
No. I mean that Mr. Kinney is an unfortunate, helpless victim of kleptomania.
Kleptomania, huh? Why don't you take something for it?
I think that's exactly what I should do.
During the Second World War, some Dutch newspapers started to publish Nazi propaganda. In these articles, kleptomania was linked to the enemies of the Aryan people as Hitler imagined them. Jews, Soviets, and the mentally ill did not fit into the National Socialist Society and were all seen as degenerates that needed to be wiped out. People suffering from kleptomania were depicted as the other. One way in which newspaper articles represented them as such is by linking them to other groups that were not accepted by society. For example, a poem book review praised the verses of warm compassion for the reprobate, the murderer, the prostitute, the kleptomaniac. It thereby linked people that suffered from kleptomania to groups with other negative attributes. Another way in which their otherness was confirmed is through the label itself. They are a kleptomaniac. Take the following example. The cartoon translates to, "Keep an eye on that man, he's a known kleptomaniac," implying that the disease defines him. He was not a man that suffered from the disease. His kleptomania is an important part of his identity, or even defines it. From the perspective of the 21st century, it reminds of the grimace of insanity of Heath Ledger's Joker in the movie The Dark Knight. Kleptomania's link to degeneration and atavism had an effect on a sufferer's social life. People did not want to marry people who suffered from mental illnesses. The media reinforced the belief that their offspring would be hereditarily burdened. So, it also impacted the siblings of the person that was suffering from kleptomania. Furthermore, suffering from kleptomania could result in the loss of work. This is depicted in the film Die vom Ruhmerplatz, which depicts that Mother Flock's kleptomania led to a loss of work and extreme poverty.
Braucht doch nicht zu wissen, wie schlecht es uns geht.
Und wer ist schuld daran, dass wir so heruntergekommen sind? Ich oder du? Hä?
Na weißt du, ein feiner Mann wirst du nie. Du hast mir doch so fest versprochen, mir das nie vorzuwerfen. Du weißt doch, Kleptomanie ist eine Krankheit, an der selbst die allerfeinsten Leute leiden.
In extreme cases, kleptomania could result in the loss of the right to reproduce. A newspaper article from 1910 makes this painfully clear. The solution was simple. Mental illnesses, and thus the mentally ill, were to be exterminated. Not with overly forgiving psychiatry, but with practical and scientific propaganda for the sterilization of criminals and the degenerated. In America, they've already started in practice. If a simple operation does not help, the cathode light can darken the miracle of life. Lastly, power played an important role. Status loss was much more likely if one's thieving behavior or kleptomania appeared in the newspapers. If one could keep their kleptomania a secret, the damage to their status and that of their family would be much smaller than if it became public. Both the criminal label and the kleptomania label were unfavorable for one's status.